Thank you, Susan. I am delighted to introduce to all of you Dr. Daniel Nagin. He is a criminologist, besides being a statistician, which is unusual for us here in the Center for Outcomes Research. He's a very distinguished academic from the United States. He's currently the Teresa and John Heinz III University Professor of Public Policy and Statistics at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. And over his career, he has won several awards. His work, his research focuses on the evolution of criminal and antisocial behaviors over the life course. And that means he studies this using longitudinal data. In particular, he's focused on the deterrent effect of criminal and non-criminal penalties on illegal behaviors and development of statistical methods for analyzing longitudinal data. I personally know of Dr. Nagin's work because of his publications in the area of group-based trajectories, which is, I think, a method that's becoming increasingly popular in our milieu as we get accustomed to gathering longitudinal data, and we want to find patterns within that longitudinal data. And I know his work has been made accessible by him because he published articles that showed how these methods can be fit using SAS software. And I think at least people like Nancy Mayo, who's in our group, I think do use SAS to apply these methods. I'll just mention one of the many, many awards he's received. He received the 2017 National Academy of Sciences Award for Scientific Reviewing. He was honored for his exemplary reviews of the scientific literature on the crime prevention effects of criminal and civil sanctions. And it was recognized that these reviews have altered the course of criminological theory and empirical research and greatly informed analysis of public policy in the United States. So thank you very much, Daniel, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Before the people came in, as you'll learn, I work closely with a group at the University of Montreal, and have visited Montreal many, many times. And as we're saying, it's one of my favorite cities in the world. So in some cases, it's nice to be able to give a talk by Zoom, but I wish I could actually give this talk in person. So thank you. So as I indicated in the introduction, by way of background, I am a criminologist, and I've been working on group-based trajectory modeling now for close to 30 years. And this is actually an example, an illustration of the very first application of group-based trajectory modeling to study criminal careers. But to sort of, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, I'll move to an example which is closer to home, I think both in terms of your interest, but quite literally close to home. This is a study that I did with my long-term collaborator, Richard Tremblay of the University of Montreal. And the data that was used to estimate this model is actually is a university, is data set that Richard assembled in Montreal. And in particular, it's a data set that is composed of about 1,000 ethnically French males and who Richard began first tracking them. Now I'm trying to remember now. I'm blocking on the exact date, but it was in the 1980s when they were in kindergarten at age 6, and then they tracked them. They continue to track them, but this example is over the first 15 years of tracking. So in particular, in this study, Richard and his colleagues, among other items, collected data on teacher ratings of the boys' physical aggression at age 6, 10, 11, 12, 13, on up through age 15. And let me just, okay, I realized I missed the important slide. Apologies, I'll come back to this. It's important in this thing is, what do I mean by a trajectory? A trajectory is the evolution of an outcome. In the case of the example that I was just talking about, a measure of physical aggression that I'll describe over age or time. And the key thing to keep in mind is that this outcome has to be measured in the same fashion it assumes that this outcome is measured in the same way at every one of the measurement occasions. So going back to this example, Richard and his colleagues had a scale, a psychometric scale of physical aggression. It was a 6-item scale measuring things like how often the boy in different ways used physical aggression. And so for the result of this was that for each one of the individuals in the sample, we had data on their physical aggression at 7 measurement occasions at the ages shown on this graph. So is that essentially, conceptually, what group-based trajectory modeling does is, even though it's not cluster analysis, as in a moment I'll show you that it's a form of maximum likelihood estimation, but conceptually, what it's designed to do is to identify clusters of individual, or you might think of them as latent strata in the data, who are following similar developmental patterns, in this case of physical aggression. And in this case, the best fitting model was a 4-group model. There was one group of boys who were estimated to account for 16% of the population, who followed a pattern of physical aggression where basically their teachers were rating them as never being physically aggressive over this entire measurement period. The modal group, the largest group, which was estimated to account for 52% of the sample population, followed a pattern of declining physical aggression from age 6 to 15. Then a second group, which we called the high desisters, were estimated to account for 28% of the population, and they started higher than this moderate group, but they steadily declined. And then finally, there was a small group of boys who were estimated to account for 4% of the population, who started high and stayed high. I could say much more about this, these trajectories if we had time, but I'll just simply note one of the striking things about these trajectories are that all of them are stable or declining, and they're therefore generally at their highest level that they're going to be at age 6, and with the implication that if you really want to study the developmental origins of physical aggression, then you have to start before age 6. And indeed, Richard and his colleagues did just that, and this study prompted them to begin tracking a birth cohort. So, as I indicated, group-based trajectory modeling, I think you should think of it as a device for identifying clusters of individuals or latent strata in the longitudinal data who are following similar trajectories. And the way these trajectory groups are identified is it's an application of something which is called finite mixture modeling. That is, it assumes that the population is comprised of a finite number of groups denoted by J. So in the last example, that was 4 groups, J equaled 4. And the likelihood function that's shown here has 2 components. The component here denoted by pi sub J measures the probability or the proportion of the population following that trajectory, which I will later show and illustrate. You can make that probability, or you can allow that probability to be a function of characteristics of the individual. Here, I denotes each of the 1,000 boys in this sample. And so X sub I you should think of as baseline characteristics of the at the outset of the study. And then this part of the likelihood function defines the trajectory for each group that was shown in the prior slide. And the key point here is that I don't have time to go it by superscripting this with J, group specific. Group-based trajectory modeling allows each trajectory group to follow its own trajectory independent of the form and shape of the other trajectory groups. And so that allows you, in principle, to have some trajectory groups, rising and falling, others only falling, others being flat. So it allows the shapes of the trajectories to be different to vary freely across group. And then finally, another point here is that the probability of trajectory group membership is specified to follow a multinomial logit function. While in this case, we didn't allow, in the prior example I gave you, as I indicated, we didn't have that probability be a function of characteristics of the trajectory. You can allow it to be that, and it will follow a multinomial logit function. So as earlier indicated, is that we have developed software, SaaS-based software, but also Stata-based software in either case. And for estimating these models, they're freely available on a website I'll show you in a moment. And they do things like they handle missing data. They can handle, the estimation software can handle sampling weights. It doesn't require regular time spacing of the measurements. It can also accommodate overlapping cohort designs. It does things like provide confidence intervals on trajectory estimates. You can do walled tests of coefficient differences and so forth. And the software and the documentation for the software is freely available at the website that's shown here. So is the software is designed to handle a number of different types of data. It's designed to handle psychometric scale data like the physical aggression data, and which have scale minimums and scale maximums. And to accommodate that kind of data, we use the censored normal model to account for the censoring of the data at the scale minimums and scale maximums. It also has the capacity to estimate models for count data. We use a Poisson-based model for that. In particular, a generalization of the basic Poisson model called the zero inflated Poisson model. We also have can handle binary data where the outcome is simply yes or no, like have you been hospitalized this period or not, at this measurement occasion or not, or have you used drugs or not on this measurement occasion. And then finally, this is not described in my I should say, by the way, the reference to Nagin 2005. In 2005, I had a book. It's called Group-Based Models of Development that was published by Harvard University Press in 2005. Since the publication of that book, we've extended the types of data or that you can model with to also include the beta distribution, which I'll explain in a moment. And the beta distribution is suitable for measuring data that is on a 0 to 1 scale. The reason we added that the beta distribution to the distributions that you can estimate models on is because for those of you who are familiar with the beta distribution, it's an extremely flexible. It's very much more so than the other distributions. Its shape, the distribution is defined by this very intimidating equation, but it's a 2-parameter distribution. And it can be parameterized in various ways. For the purposes of trajectory modeling, it is one parameter is mu, the expected value of the outcome that you're interested in, and its variance. The other parameter is that's estimated is phi, which is a precision parameter, which defines the variance of y by this equation. And the reason it's really helpful is you can just see it's very flexible distribution, and because depending on the values of phi or mu, these are the many different kinds of shapes that this distribution can take on. We did it. I'll explain this slide to you in a little bit of detail because I'll be talking about it more as we go on. It was part of a collaboration I'm doing with a physician at the University of UPMC, which is the major medical center here in Pittsburgh. And my collaborator specializes in the care of severely neurologically damaged patients. So in particular, the data we're studying are data from cardiac arrest patients that are brought into the UPMC ICU. And a measure of their neurological activity is called the suppression ratio, which goes from a scale of 0 to 100% or 0 to 1. And when your neurological activity is not suppressed at all, it's hovering at around 0. And so hopefully for all of us who are watching this or listening to this lecture, that's where our suppression ratio is close to 0. And then it increases up to 100%. And so, and this what for the entire data set that John, my collaborator, at hour 12, this is what the shape of the suppression ratio looked like for the patients, in our data set. So was peaks both at 0 and at 1, and this is an example of the beta distribution fitting that. And so, in particular, when we applied this, estimated a group-based trajectory model to these data based on the first 48 hours of measurements of the patient's neurological activity. For a 3-group model, we identified 3 groups here. One group whose suppression ratio was low throughout this measurement period, and they had the best survival prospects. I'll be talking more about that at about 70%. For the beta model, base model trajectory for this group looked like this. There was a middle group which started high but then later declined, and their survival prospects were about 30%, and the shape of the trajectory modeling this group kind of looks like this, but at a more elevated level. And then finally, there was another group where their cardiac, their suppression ratio started high, and even though it declined slightly, it remained high. And the individuals in this group, their survival prospects were very low at 2.3%. And what you can see is the trajectory of the suppression ratio for this group is the mirror image of for groups 1 and 2. And I think it illustrates the flexibility that the beta distribution brings to bear. So moving along more quickly, one of the most valuable products from group-based trajectory modeling is something called the posterior probability of group membership. And this is just simply a simple application of Bayes' rule or Bayes' theorem. And so specifically, once we've estimated the model, for each individual, we know what their suppression ratio is. We have a vector of their suppression ratios, let's say over the first 48 hours, or in the case of the Montreal data, we have a vector of a boy's physical aggression over the 7 measurement periods. And then we want to say, given this boy's data or this patient's data, what's the probability that their data was generated by one of the each of the J trajectory groups? And that probability, once we've estimated the model, can be calculated by Bayes' rule, because once we've estimated the model, we have estimates of the sizes of each of the trajectory groups, and we have the estimates of the parameters of the data distribution, which is generating the data for each group J. So we can calculate the probability of the data, given that they're a member of group J, and weighted by the probability of group J. And then by Bayes' rule, we can therefore get we can get the probability of the person that probability of each person's data was generated by each of the trajectory groups. And another thing that we do, which is convenient, is that the software, the trajectory estimation software, assigns people gives an assignment to the trajectory group for which this posterior probability is maximum, is as large as is at maximum value. And with that, you can just begin to do some very interesting, what I think are useful summaries of the data. And I think that specifically clinical audiences, I think tend to, in my experience, value these kinds of very simple data summaries. And so all I've done here is, this is simply a cross tabulation of the group that each boy was assigned to, and various characteristics that were measured about the boy at different times in the during the study. And so these 3 measurements were measured at baseline. And what we can see is that as the education of the boy's father and mother, as that their educational level declines, the likelihood that they're in one of the higher physical aggression trajectory groups increases. It's also the case that the more physically aggressive boys tend to have tend to have lower IQs. One thing that really caught our attention, particularly in the case of the boys who are chronically physically aggressive, is is that nearly all of them have fallen behind, are no longer at grade level by the 8th grade. And what we can see here is, for example, is that the likelihood that a boy will have a juvenile record after age 15 by the end of the trajectory increases very substantially with across the trajectory groups. And as I said, this is just a simple data summary, but it's one that I think clinical audiences find very attractive. It's a very transparent kind of analysis that many people like to see. But it's also possible using, as I said, we can make probability of trajectory group membership. We can allow it to be a function of baseline characteristics of the individual, and in the basic likelihood function, we specify the probability of trajectory group membership to follow a multinomial logit function as shown here. And then here's an application of this again to the Montreal data, the physical aggression data, where we allowed the probability of trajectory group membership to be a function of 4 different characteristics of the boy. Whether or not the boy had a low IQ, whether or not we could define a broken home as at baseline, we called it broken if he wasn't living with both biological parents. And then low ed mom was again a categorical variable. These variables don't have to be categorical, but these are all. If the mother was in the lower quartile of the education distribution of the mothers in the sample, teen mom is whether or not the mother began childbearing as a teenager, and it turns out that all 4 of these variables are significant predictors of trajectory group memberships. That is, they in a significant way alter the probability of trajectory group membership. But what I've done here in this data summary is taken based on the coefficient estimates that we get, from estimating this model. We get estimates of the theta j's in this equation. And then once you have the estimates of the theta j's in the model, that allows you to compute the probability of trajectory group membership for a boy who has none of these 4 risk factors. Here we calculate those probabilities for a boy who has all of the risk factors, and then for each one of these in between, we calculated the probability of trajectory group membership for a boy who had a low IQ, but didn't come from a broken home, didn't have a poorly educated mom or a teen mom. And so these bars here measure the case where we turn on the broken home risk factor, but keep the others off, and so forth. And so what you see here is that while each one of these risk factors individually does change the probabilities of being in the different trajectory groups. So as you can see, for example, this is for a boy who has a low IQ, his estimated probability of being in the moderately declining trajectory group declines from 0.6 to 0.5, for example. But when you turn on only one of these, even though they are significantly changing the probabilities, the basic shape of these trajectories remains the same. That is, the moderately declining is the largest trajectory group, and the chronic group is the smallest trajectory group. However, when you turn on all of the risk factors, then you get a very dramatically different change in the probabilities of trajectory group membership. And I think this is really a very nice illustration of what cumulative disadvantage is, that no single risk factor is decisive. It's the accumulation of risk factors that, in this case, greatly alters the chances of trajectory group membership. So, and I should say that the software allows you, there's ways that you can use the software actually to calculate these probabilities for any combination of profiles, risk factor profiles that you might be interested in doing. So another thing that you can do is, by the way, I'm moving through this. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to entertain questions as we go on. But
yeah. There was one question from Kaberi, just asking whether, when you mentioned the beta distribution style outcomes, she wanted to know whether continuous outcomes like blood pressure can also be handled with these trajectories.
The answer is yes. If there are two ways in the data set, the data that you can handle blood pressure measurements. You could use the so-called sensor normal model, and you can set the censoring levels such blood pressure in principle, is not censored. And so there's some straightforward ways to turn off the censoring, and just treat the successive observations as being normally distributed. Another alternative, and I don't know enough about blood pressure variation physiologically, but you can also use the beta distribution. Because the way the beta distribution is used is formally it's for variables that are on a zero, measurements that are on a 0 to 1 scale, like the suppression ratio is formally on a 0 to 1 scale. But it's also often used, particularly when people have highly skewed data, where they sort of basically take the maximum value in your data set and normalize everything relative to the maximum value. So the highest blood pressure, in your data set. And so therefore you put it on a 0-1 scale, and therefore you could use the beta distribution. So if that was the case, but I don't know enough about blood pressure to know whether that would be it would be a desirable thing to do. I mean, physiologically, about how blood pressure varies. Does that answer the question for the person who asked it?
Yeah,
yes,
Kaberi, I hope
yes,
so.
it does.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So another thing that you can do is you can take trajectories. In this example, by making the probability of trajectory group membership be a function of risk factors measured at baseline, you can ask, how do baseline measurements affect the probability of following the various different trajectories? Okay, so what are the factors, for example, that early on in life heighten the risk of a boy following, for example, the trajectory of chronic physical aggression? Or what factors distinguish boys who are chronically physically aggressive from those who begin declining, and so forth. So, but another interesting question is to take trajectories and link them to outcomes. So in this case, this is again where we took the trajectories of physical aggression from age 6 to 15 and linked them to the number of sexual partners that the boy had at age 16. And what we see here is the the points here are the expected, or we see that on average, the expected number of sexual partners steadily increases with across the 4 trajectory groups. From for the boys who are never physically aggressive, their number of sexual partners is smallest. The moderate declining is next highest. The high declining is next highest. And again, the chronic boys are highest. And these bars here these are confidence intervals for the estimates of the number of sexual partners the boy will have at age 16 across the different trajectory groups. Another example of this is getting back to my analysis of the survival prospects for people who, based on their suppression ratio, their suppression ratio trajectory. What we see here is that, again, is we can link for a person who's following this low, low suppression ratio, is that 64% of them survive, and 40% of them have what we call a good outcome. And what I mean by that is, some people, what survival means is that they're discharged from the hospital alive. But sometimes they're discharged from the hospital alive, but in a comatose state. So what good outcome means is not only they're alive, but they're cognitively aware. And so what we see is that as we go up through suppression ratios that are ever higher, that the survival prospects steadily decline, and as do the probability of a good outcome. So in particular, the people who followed this trajectory of elevated physical, I keep saying physical, of the suppression ratio, only 2% of them survived, and none of them had a good outcome. So,
excuse me.
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question. Did you determine these by assigning the trajectory groups deterministically?
No, the outcomes, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Good. Very good question. I should have said that. They are jointly estimated as part of the estimation procedure, and so and your question is a good one, because is that if you simply assign them did these outcomes based on assigned trajectory group, like I did in the crosstab, for example, is that doesn't take account of uncertainty in trajectory group membership.
So you do dual trajectories, and one of them is binary, and the other one is your cardiac groups?
Okay, no.
No?
Okay, no. Is what's going on here is the likelihood function that for estimating these trajectories is the same as as I showed you at the outset.
Okay.
But then that likelihood function is generalized to also include the outcome variable of interest. So it's a joint, it's a joint likelihood function. So they're jointly estimated, and therefore the estimation process yields not only the parameters for estimating these trajectories,
Okay.
but also the parameters to estimate these survival prospects, along with their standard errors. Am I getting at the issue you wanted?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay. So there are jointly estimated, and therefore takes account of the uncertainty of trajectory group membership.
Thank you.
Okay. We've also um, have something more recently, have expanded things, the trajectory group models, to do what we call multi-trajectory modeling. So in all the examples I've given you, we have trajectories for a single outcome. A trajectory group is defined by a trajectory of physical aggression or the suppression ratio. In multi-trajectory group modeling, each group is defined by trajectories for multiple different outcomes. Multiple. Each group is defined by trajectories for multiple outcomes. So this is again using the Montreal data that I've been discussing, and I call this my sex, drugs, and rock and roll study, in which each trajectory group is, in this case, defined by a trajectory for the boy's physical aggression from 8 to 13, his violent delinquency from 13 to 17, his drug use from 11 to 17. And by the way, drug use basically means in these data, either alcohol or marijuana use. It's basically what it's measuring. And then finally, the trajectories of the number of sexual partners they have from 11 to 17. And so, what you see from this is that, for example, is that trajectory group 1 is comprised of the boys who are, compared to all the other groups, the least physically aggressive. They don't engage, as a practical matter, in any violent delinquency. Their drug use is, which as I indicated, is mostly alcohol and marijuana. I think is pretty normative. And they're not sexually active from 13 to 17. But by contrast, if you compare groups 2 and 3, they have pretty similar trajectories of physical aggression, fairly similar trajectories of violent delinquency, which is actually quite low. Their drug use trajectories are the same, but group 2 is not sexually active, but this group is sexually active. So you get those kinds of mixtures of behavior across different outcomes. This is another interesting, this is a medical outcome, a medical application of multi-trajectory modeling to the study of chronic kidney disease. And so the data for this analysis came from a very large nephrology practice here in the Pittsburgh area. The people who ran this practice very generously provided an enormous amount of data on their patients and the progression of their kidney disease to one of my colleagues, Rema Padman, and she and I and others, responsible for doing this analysis. So just by way of background, all of the patients in this practice are pretty much, they're entering the practice with stage 3 kidney disease. And I guess I'm not an expert on kidney disease, and so if there's anybody in the audience who is, they can chime in to correct me if I mischaracterize this. But the standard measure of kidney functioning is the EGFR, and it's a measure such that the higher the level of EGRF, the better. And one thing I've learned, from working with these data is that kidney disease is a terrible disease because it has a lot of comorbidities associated with it, like anemia and many others. And so in this multi-trajectory group analysis, we have for each one of the trajectory groups, we have their over time, the patient's basic measure of kidney functioning, and plus the levels of these different kinds of other biomarkers for other comorbidities to kidney disease like anemia. And so in this model, we've arrayed as best we can, the groups from best. So this is the group which has the highest eGFR, which is good. They're the least anemic, and for these other measures, they're in the best range. And then, whereas this group one that is doing worse on pretty much all of these measures, of functioning. And so, as it turns out, for example, I think none of the people in group 3 went on to having higher stage kidney, went beyond, progressed beyond stage 3 kidney disease, where many of the individuals in this group, one of the outcomes was that they entered a thing of end stage kidney disease. So this is still another example of multi-trajectory modeling. It was a medical application. And then I think I'll close out with this one example, which might be of interest to you. I'm going back to my work with the physician at the UPMC physician. The reason for our collaboration was that we wanted to try to develop a method for making prognostic predictions of the survival prospects of individuals, who were brought into the ICU. And so we wanted to be able to say, well, at the outset, what's our estimate of their survival prospects? And as time goes on, let's say on an hourly basis, as we get more and more data particularly on their suppression ratio, to be able to update those estimates of the person's survival prospect. And so the way we did this was, we did this again based using the posterior probabilities of group membership. So in particular, in the examples that I showed you, at the outset, the posterior probability of group membership, let's say, would be based. Let's say if we're thinking, if we have, suppose we estimate a model like on this one with 48 hours worth of suppression ratio data. Well, after 48 hours, we can do a posterior probability calculation of group membership. And for these data, after 48 hours, you can, with virtual certainty, assign people to the different trajectory groups, as it turns out. But what this calculation is showing is that you don't have to calculate the posterior probability of group membership necessarily on all 48 hours of data. You can calculate that probability, let's say if you're doing this on an hourly basis, as you get more, you can do a calculation based on the first 12 hours of suppression ratio data. Then you can do another one on the next 13 hours, 14 hours, 15 hours, and so forth. So you can keep updating your posterior probability calculations using this formula. And then we can estimate the person's get an estimate of their probability of survival by weighting the survival probability for each one of the trajectory groups by our latest estimate of the probability that they're in that trajectory group. And so you can do that. And the software, this data or SAS-based software, I won't get into the details of this right now, it's been updated so that it will give you estimates, in this case, on an hourly basis throughout for all the data you have of what each individual's estimated probability of survival is. So the software has been updated to do that. And so, here's, an example of just to illustrate what you, for two patients for the prior model. And so we have these two patients, and early on, the red probabilities refer to the probability, the posterior probability that the person's in the high suppression ratio, the high suppression ratio trajectory, which, if you remember, has the worst survival prospects. The yellow line measures the probability of their being in the middle trajectory group, the mid-level suppression ratio trajectory group, and the green one is the probability of their being in the low one, with high survival prospects. So for these two patients, early on, the highest probability was for being in the high suppression ratio data, high suppression ratio trajectory, and therefore both of them initially had low probabilities estimates of surviving. But as time went on, this patient's suppression ratio started improving, started declining, and the posterior probability of being in group 2 started rising as the group 3 was declining, and the survival prospects started rising for this patient. And then finally, by about hour 30, the low suppression ratio trajectory started rising up, and along with it, an increased estimate in the probability of this person surviving with it. And so, as it turned out, in these two examples, whereas this person just stayed in the high, with the probability of his or her being in the high suppression ratio trajectory, started high and just stayed high. And as it turned out, this patient, in fact, did not survive, did die, whereas this patient did survive. So that's sort of the latest work we've been doing on trying to use the trajectories to in this case, to predict some outcome, in this case, survival. So given their time, I'm going to skip over this last one and just leave open up for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. I'll turn to the audience. Yes.
Nandini, could I just make a comment?
Sure.
Rather than a question, I'm not sure how many people in this audience realize that your data on trajectories is responsible for our $5 daycare in Quebec. So we instigated $5 daycare based on both this work and work interesting of Alex Schwartzman, who's Kevin Schwartzman's father, about early aggressions and their effect on long-term trajectories. And the government decided to instigate pay now or pay later. And I'm sure there's many people in this audience. It's now, I think, up to $8 a day, but it's from these data. So these had real world implications.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish I had reminded another person who deserves a lot of responsibility for that is Richard Tremblay.
Yeah.
For those of you who've never met him, he's a very persuasive guy.
So thank you for that.
Okay.
Thank you, Nancy, for sharing that. Any other questions from the audience?
Well, I want to thank you then both for back in the day, the $5 a day daycare that my kids did get. And thank you, Nancy, for telling me about that. So that is awesome. I wish Quebec were as progressive now as it was then, but anyway, that's a whole other story. I guess, it's so fascinating what you've shown us. And one of the things that kind of crossed my mind was that in a way, when we group things and we'll do quartiles of data and we'll group people accordingly. It seems to me what I'm seeing is like if you have enough data, it's a more sensible and rational way of grouping, as opposed to simply using kind of the traditional statistical approaches that we have, and to see if the higher end is different from the lower end. Am I making the analogy correctly?
I think that's a fair statement. Part of this grouping. I think we're hard as human beings. We're kind of hardwired to think in terms of categories.
Yes.
And I think part of the reason this has been particularly attractive in medicine is because medicine is about diagnosing, and various ways of categorizing people. And so I've always thought of this as being an evolution of clinical cutoffs. In the past, people, sort of, they created groups by using clinical cutoffs, and the people who were doing it were smart people, doing, in a clever way. But we've also shown, I think, with this work, with this method, that using clinical cutoffs has two risks associated. One is overfitting, is sort of, creating groups that really aren't there. But also, I think even more important is not appreciating that there are in the data distinctive paths that we hadn't conceived of. And showing that they're there. And so I think that's another, really valuable use of trajectory modeling, or the way trajectory modeling advanced things.
And am I right in saying that this is kind of what machine learning tries to do, I guess, with more data, but basically to figure out those patterns?
Yes, I mean, that is, I think, a fair, a fair statement, is that, and the interesting, it is a fair statement. In some cases, it does so and does not. I mean, it's interesting that in saying that is, I was just actually earlier in the day in a conversation with my collaborator, from UPMC on these data, and he was he's been successful in getting a very large grant, $5 million grant from NIH to continue this work, and there was a machine learning component to it as well, and he was speculating that he didn't think that the elaborate machine learning model was going to do any better than what we've done.
Interesting.
But we'll see. But we'll see.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to sort of officially thank Daniel, since it's 5 o'clock, and I suspect some people will start leaving now. But I was just wondering if you'd be willing to stay on for a couple more questions, if there are any.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right. Okay. So again, anybody in the audience with a question?
I was just going to say that we use this a lot, especially for getting a first look at our longitudinal data. It's a great way to visualize what you've got. And then we may decide to do our final analysis with it, and we may move to something else, but we always start here with our longitudinal data.
Good.
So it's been very nice to meet you.
It's very nice, and very nice to meet you as well.
I have a question.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
that
the
is,
purple book
it's-
is the Bible in our office.
Yeah.
So who has your purple book?
my question is, you presented now a number of examples where you showed us where there are clearly delineated trajectories.
Right.
But do you always get that? I imagine, especially if you have a small sample size or not many data points, not many longitudinal observations, you may have an unclear separation between trajectories. Even in some of your own examples, there were just 2% of subjects in one of the trajectories. And how do you handle that? How do you handle, when do you say, okay, now we've got enough information to say this is a real trajectory, this is not just noise?
Yeah. Well, so that let me try to do that. That's a very good question, but it's a question that doesn't lend itself to a quick answer. But so let me try on it. Is that with regard to a small group, let's say 2%, I think you have to ask, is it realistic to think is if it's 2% of a small, like if it's 2% of a sample of 1,000, like the Montreal study, then that's too small, I think, to be credible. But on the other hand, if in an application I was doing with some Dutch collaborators, and this was a crime example where we had a huge data set of criminal records. I've forgotten how large it was. It was tens of thousands of people, of the criminal records of people in the Netherlands. There was a 2% group who were getting, convicted at very high levels, but they involved many thousands of people, and and from other ways in the data we could tell that these were people who were drug addicts and who were repeatedly getting arrested for stealing to pay for their drug habits. So that was an instance in which we could say, even though it's a small group in percentage terms, we're confident that it's there. I mean, that this is a real, a real group. Related to that is, which is another part of, I think, your problem, not the question you asked, is that the purpose of trajectory modeling, these groups are not real groups. That's why I call them clusters or latent strata in the data. And you have to always ask yourself the question in terms of, there are ways of deciding on the number of trajectory groups based on measures like the Bayesian information criteria or AIC and so forth. But beyond that, I think you have to ask, are these distinctive features in the data? And that they're telling me something interesting relative to the question, we're trying to answer. And so another reason in my Dutch study that we, of course, kept the 2% group was we were studying crime. And so identifying a chronically, a very high rate kind of a offending group is in fact a very interesting group for the purposes of our study. So you have to both ask, is it a distinctive feature that's relevant to your study? So that's a short answer to your question.
Thank you. And it seems to me that both the examples that you gave, I feel like you're saying that some external information might be helpful. So if you have external information on habitual drug use, or in the 2% group in Quebec, maybe you had some information on what kind of homes these children came from, or something like that. That seemed.
Well, I think in the Quebec example, it wasn't 2%; it was 4%.
Okay, it was 4%.
No, and that was pushing. That was an important group. It was relatively, in terms of the number of people in the data set, it was like 40 or 50. So it was 40 or so. It was getting on the small side, but for reasons I can elaborate on, it was a really it's a really important group because it's an example of what Terry Moffat calls life course persistence, and they were behaving in a very distinctive way. The boys who followed that chronic trajectory had all kinds of very bad outcomes, both during from age 6 to 15, like having very high school failure rates, but it was also very predictive of later contact with the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much.
I had a question if you still have the time, unless
Sure.
I'm keeping everybody online. Hi, my name is Orit, and I'm very novice in the group-based area right now. I've kind of started with linear trajectories, and now I'm moving forward with group-based trajectories, trying to wrap my head around things. And I was just wondering, once we've identified the various groups and we've found predictors of each group, is there a way to be able to delineate which risk factors amongst the trajectories are most impactful to be able to transition between trajectories? So from kind of a cost perspective, where would you put your money if you really want to shift someone from one trajectory to another?
Is the good question. Is that the work that I showed you, in this talk, do not allow people to move across trajectories. The assumption is you follow a trajectory. There's ways that you can, we've done this, where you can put variables in it, like, failing in school, and ask, does that deflect the trajectory? Or if you put some kind of treatment program, does it deflect the trajectory? But the sort of the logic of the model is that you don't switch trajectories, okay? But there is a version of this called joint trajectory modeling, which is a whole different stuff, where you could ask the question of whether an intervention changes the trajectory you're following, okay? So that's not a real satisfactory answer to your question, because it would be very long, and it's a good one, but so.
Oh, I got lots of very satisfactory answers from this talk, so I really appreciate your time.
Okay. So,
thank you. I think I don't see any other questions.
Nandini, there was one request for the website again.
Oh, there was a request. Oh, I'm sorry.
okay.
It was sent directly to me, not to the general chat.
Oh, okay. Can you?
If you two ways of doing that. If you simply Google group-based trajectory modeling, it'll take you to the site. But if you would like, if people are interested, I'm happy to make a PDF of this presentation and share it with people if they would. I'm happy to share the presentation, which among other things includes the website.
Okay, great. That would be great.
Okay, so one thing I'm actually now feeling bad about. So when the recording, you have a link to the recording, please send it to me. I feel bad that I didn't invite Richard to participate.
Okay, I'll send you the link tomorrow when I post it.
Okay.
Okay, and I'll send you a PDF of the presentation, which you can share with anybody who's interested.
All right.
So thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you all for being here this afternoon, and have a good evening.